Never.
All right, welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I am Kevin J. Hughes, and I'm here with Matthew Emerson, my co-host. And today we have special guest Caleb J. Mullins. Now, Caleb is a deacon in the Anglican Church, and
working on it. Not quite yet.
Oh, he's becoming a deacon, excuse me, and he's also running catechesis for your local parish.
That's one of the positions I'm seeking to do. Yeah. So this is, I guess, what you would call this is discerning a call right now. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So he's discerning this call. He is also a werewolf. So
Yes.
There's that. And we also have Matthew Emerson, who is the senior writer of Vespers in Vienna and Verse of the Day, and is also People Magazine's sexiest man alive.
I don't know. There's two truths and a lie there, so I'll let the viewers pick which one is the false
which
one.
ones are which. And then there's me. You all know me, so I'm not going to introduce myself. So without further ado, we are going to cover the most controversial topic that we've ever covered. Not really. Monarchy and the Christian church. Yeah, nihilism might have been more controversial.
Politics and religion, the two things you aren't supposed to talk about in good company.
That's right.
If we threw in sex in here, it would be a triple header.
Terrible company.
Yeah.
I also I recognize I am talking very far out of my area of expertise right now. So this is more of just like, I don't know. This is just me kind of shooting from the hip on this one. Like, give me psych and nihilism and you're your guy. But arguing political theory, I have several friends who are going to laugh at the fact that I am the one on this show right now.
Well, see, that's why we brought in Caleb. He's our politics expert. And this gives Matthew the opportunity. He can be our psychology of monarchy person, help us with the... No.
Yeah.
Okay, so to begin with, Caleb, why don't you lay out for us a biblical case for monarchy, and we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. So monarchy, of course, let's just do the basic definition, is being ruled by one single ruler or the monarch. And usually, I guess you could also include his extended family in there because they rule to some extent, such as the queen, the prince, the princess, etc. And I would limit my definition of monarchy to absolute monarchism. I'm not talking about constitutional monarchy. I'm not talking about a king who's a figurehead or something like that. I'm talking straight up king's word is law, monarchy. And I think there's a good biblical basis to be made that monarchy is one of the best, if not the best, government systems there can be for any nation or place at any time. And now, that's not to say that human nature doesn't play a factor in this. Like any sort of system, you're going to have some pros and cons to any sort of political system just because human beings are rotten. But I think whenever you weigh the pros and cons of monarchy against other forms of government, such as democracy, republicanism, parliamentary kind of things, or even communism, socialism, I think that the pros of monarchy far outweigh the cons of the others, even when just making a slight comparison. The other thing that I would point out is I think monarchy is also the only governmental system that is, one, completely stable. I better make sure I show my finger there because I go behind my name there. But it's completely stable. It's self-correcting over time. And it's the one that makes the most sense with the way human nature unfolds. And it makes the most sense in regards to man's relationship to God. Mm-hmm. That's it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. So where can we see some examples in Scripture of why monarchy would be the best system? Because I know that our Sola Scriptura peeps are going to yell at us that we need to show it to them in Scripture.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I think that, well, let's deal with it this way, if it's okay. One of the objections that's going to be brought up to the idea of monarchy especially an idea of absolute monarchy where the king has all the power and can basically snap his fingers and do what he wants. One of the objections is going to be to that is like, well, look at ancient Israel. Look at how bad, Israel acted and then said, give us a king. We don't want God as our king. Okay, fair enough. Fair point. But one of the things I would like to point out to those folks before we get to the whole situation in Samuel, in the first book of Samuel, is that the Lord had already laid out provisions for a monarchy for Israel back when Moses was still alive. And where we can find this is in Deuteronomy chapter 17, and I believe it's verse 17. Let me make sure we get this right. Here we go. It's starting in verse 14 of Deuteronomy chapter 17. It says, when thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are about me. Thou shalt in any wise case set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set a king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For so much as the Lord hath said unto you, you shall henceforth return no more that way, neither shall he multiply wives unto himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. So the interesting thing about all this is that Israel has just come out of slavery for 400 years. Before this, Israel was basically a group of tribal chieftains led by certain family members. And basically every man was a warrior. Every man was sort of a head of his own household, etc. And then being in Egypt, being subject to the Pharaoh, where you're pretty much fodder to be used to build, structures to use to feed the Egyptians, etc. And then all of a sudden they're brought out of this status of being slaves and into this kind of mixed group, which is primarily Hebrew people, but also some people from Egypt that went along with them, what the Bible calls the mixed multitude of people. And as things start to sort of gradually unfold, it becomes very clear that Moses is going to be sort of the head figure at the time, since he's the one that started the Exodus. And later on, we see, of course, that Moses appoints people to replace him, such as Joshua. So we already see some things borrowed from monarchy that are already being used, such as succession, the idea of naming your successor, although this was not obviously Moses' sons, but somebody who he had trained to take his place. Right. And but nonetheless, it's almost like the Lord expects that eventually Israel will have a full-fledged monarchy like other nations. And because of that, he sets in place, here's how you do it once you get to that point. He never says anything to the effect of, well, I'm really your only king, but just in case you hate me, here's how you set up a monarchy. There's no language like that at all. Right, exactly. In Deuteronomy, it's like, if you want to do that, okay, you can do that if you want to do that. And he's like, but here's the conditions. I get to choose him. I keep forgetting this thing's in reverse. I get to choose him. He cannot have a lot of gold. He cannot have a lot of horses, in other words, cavalry, chariots, like the other nations have. And he cannot have multiple wives. So he's like, you follow those conditions, you can have a king.
Right. Which that actually sets us up for, I think, the real issue that's taking place in 1 Samuel. When the people cry out for a king, they're crying out for a king, quote, like the other nations. So the issue isn't that they want to have a king. God had always intended that Israel would one day have a king, as laid out by Deuteronomy 17, 14 and on. Right. But the problem was they wanted to have a king like the other nations had a king, which is what they even say. We want a king who will lead us out into war. We want a king who will do this and that. And God is saying, well, I already gave you the outline for what a king should be, and what you want isn't that. They wanted a king who would be like the other nations' kings,
Right.
and that was sinful.
Exactly. And I think that in all honesty, Israel asking for a king was a good thing to do in 1 Samuel chapter 8, because just to read this, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 3, it says quite clearly about Samuel's sons. And Samuel's sons, walked not in his way, but turned aside after lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment. So we already kind of see that the old system of the judge being over Israel is sort of falling apart. And we even see that in the book of Judges. For example, when we get to Samson, who I believe is the last judge, my goodness. I mean, Samson, both a noble guy and a tragic guy. He has, he's the number one problem he has is women and his own pride, obviously. But we sort of see the whole, and also Gideon before him, garnering a bunch of wives and setting himself up as high priest. I mean, we see the judge system is starting to go downhill as well. But I think they made the right move in asking for a king. But like you said, their intent was that, well, we want a king, but he has to be like everybody else. I'm like,
right,
okay.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And the other thing is, because I know that this objection gets brought up a lot, is, well, Samuel didn't want them to take a king. The problem with that objection is that traditionally the Jews have always taught that Samuel was the writer of the book of Judges. Mm-hmm. And in the book of Judges, he makes several references to the fact that at that time Israel had no king, and therefore everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So Samuel is recognizing the problems of the existing system and the need that a king will arise. But again, he's troubled by the immaturity of the people and the fact that they're asking for a king not according to God's system, but according to their own human desires and wants.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think that Deuteronomy 17 really becomes an important linchpin in any discussion of monarchy from a biblical perspective, because it shows us that this was always part of God's intention behind Israel, but the Israelites obviously went outside of God's intention. And that's why the first king God appoints is exactly what they asked for. They wanted a king like the other nations. He gives them a king like the other nations, shows them how miserable that is, and then gives them the man after his own heart, who, by the way, still doesn't actually follow Deuteronomy 17.
Right. And Solomon even less so.
Right. Solomon goes way off if you go through Deuteronomy 17 and then go through the reign of Solomon, it's really actually quite disheartening to see how every single thing mentioned in Deuteronomy 17 for a king not to do is exactly what Solomon rushes headlong after.
Solomon, you're reading that backwards, bro.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to, we covered it a little bit, but I want to get back into it a little bit. Why is monarchy a better system? And maybe we can just do a short comparison system to system, or maybe we want to talk up monarchy a little bit. But why is monarchy a better system than other systems out there? Democracy, republicanism, communism, socialism, and for that matter, why is absolute monarchy better than, say, England's current system of their sort of half and half, where you have a monarchy, but there's also this representative government? Why do we say that absolute monarchy is not just biblical, but also better? What are the advantages there?
I think the first thing is that in the whole narrative of the Bible, and if you understand the doctrine of creation and the created order of the world itself, monarchy models that. It parallels that, but on a microcosm sort of way. So the great macrocosm is God being the monarch over the universe he has created. You know, whatever he says goes. If he says, let there be light, there is light. If one of his creations rebels, such as Satan, you know, he casts him out of his status, that sort of thing. So in the human terms, the monarchy that can be set up in a human government sort of reflects what kind of man's original call, which was to subdue the earth, right? Even before there was a fall, however you view the fall, meaning like whatever doctrine of creation model you want to take. The point is, God's original call was for man to multiply on the earth, subdue the earth, and reign over it, right? And the Eastern Fathers of the Church actually have an interesting idea that man was always meant to be in this status of theosis, this idea of man becoming like God, right? Or what some of our folks watching may call sanctification. And in this process, man is learning to be like God, not only in a way that is morally reflective of God, but also naturally reflective of God. Not that man can acquire a divine nature. There's only one being that has a divine nature, and that's God.
Right.
But that man can participate in that divine nature and emulate that by allowing basically God to flow through him, if that makes sense. So there's also, if you look at, especially in men, for example, there's this need to conquer, this need to perfect, this need to explore and discover and things like that. And I think that was part of our original call. And now we've got a lot more things to conquer, thanks to our first parents deciding to not finish what God asked us to do. But the idea is that the same call that God made in the garden is still here. And I think that monarchy, especially absolute monarchy, where you know who the authority is, right? Here's the first comparison between monarchy and all other forms, especially, let's just take democracy, for example. Everybody seems to like democracy these days. I don't understand why. I really don't. To quote my favorite philosopher in the world, Socrates, he said, "I would rather do philosophy under a tyrant than in a democracy."
Ooh, that's really interesting.
Socrates hated democracy with a passion. And where did he live? Athens, like the central birthplace of democracy, right?
Exactly.
And the reason why he hated it so much, let me just give you a perfect example. He got into a debate with a politician one time who was telling him democracy was the best form of government in the world. And Socrates, that's when he said, "I'd rather do democracy under a tyrant than in a democracy." And he said, "How could you say such a thing, Socrates?" And he said, "Well, let me give you a perfect example." He said, if you had an admiral of a fleet, and all of a sudden your admiral died, he said, how would you like it if I went into town and I asked for a group of people to vote, and I asked the blacksmith, the prostitute, the beggar, the executioner, the potter, the blacksmith, plus all the politicians to all vote on who's going to be the next admiral, and all their votes are going to be equal. And you know what the politician said? He said, that's absolutely absurd. Why would you do that? And he said, but wait a minute. He said, you as a politician just told me democracy is the greatest thing in the world. Why would you have a problem with this? And he said, because they're not qualified.
Exactly.
And then Socrates said, well, then how are you advocating for democracy where you're asking billions of people to vote to change a system they know virtually nothing about?
Yep.
And that's the and I think that's a perfect example of how monarchy is far more biblical, because one, you know who the authority is. You know that there is somebody who has been appointed over you, not by vote, not by your decision, but by powers that are beyond your comprehension. This goes for Christian kings. This goes for pagan kings too. It doesn't matter.
That's right.
But what it means is that, and it also, it taps into the giftings of certain people. Like, for example, not everybody is a born leader. Not everybody is a born soldier. Now, can a person be trained for those certain things? Sure, to an extent. But it's sort of like the Navy SEALs will say, they'll train 10 people, 8 of them, one of them will be a failure, 8 of them will be soldiers, and 1 of them will be a born warrior. There's a difference, right? And so I think what monarchy does, especially when you consider you have a monarch, which means you'll also have nobility, you'll have the gentry, you'll have the aristocrats, and then you'll have sort of the upper middle class, lower middle class, and then the poor, is that when you have that stratification in mind, you start to realize that people's talents fit into a certain category. Like, for example, you may have a person who does not strive to be better than their status. For example, this person may want to be a farmer and they never may want to get a PhD and teach at a college. Okay, fine.
Right.
Then you fit into this certain category. This person may be skilled with his hands. He ends up becoming a blacksmith, right? So there's also that, the idea that it actually recognizes there is differences in human talent and human ability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point. And Matthew, I want to draw on your expertise a little bit here. What do you think might be some sort of psychological benefits to a society like that, where everybody's talents are able to contribute and where we're all contributing to a society underneath a clear authority like that?
I have a couple things.
Sure.
I will happily answer. Do my best to take a shot in the dark with cultural psychology. But permit me to be the filthy modernist for a little bit.
Okay, fair enough.
A couple things I want to ask about, or push back a little bit on, because like ideally, like I'll just show my cards. Like ideally, I'm a monarchist. Like I recognize that I do think it is the Christian ideal form of government. Practically speaking, I'm probably an American constitutionalist, like just being honest. Like I don't think the founders were like outside of the realm of a good idea with how they set up our government if it were to be practiced properly, which is not being, but we'll get to that in a second. A lot of the things, and again, maybe my medieval knowledge is wrong. I'll happily, again, I'm speaking out of my area of expertise. So really, actually, that means I'm a perfect modern because I have opinions on things I don't understand. So that the division of social stratification that you brought up, I don't really ever think existed much in Christendom. You had
that way, no.
large body. So, like, again, we're speaking of what a monarchy would look like right now if it just happened.
Yeah.
We don't know if that's the case because we don't know what an absolute monarchy would look like in a post-industrial society. So I don't know if you can make all of those claims perfectly. 2, I don't think absolutism is necessarily the Christian ideal. I would say the first absolutist monarch we ever encountered was Henry VIII. And I think that he set the precedent for the absolutist age that came in the Renaissance that caused the Sun King. Like, I don't think, and again, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, like one bad king invalidate monarchy. Like, I'm that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that I don't think that absolutism of like what you mean by absolutism is the absolutism that came from the 1700s. I don't think that's the Christian ideal. I don't think that's what most Christian kings acted like post like fall of Rome into Renaissance. They were way more limited in their power. The nobles held a lot over them. Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, says that there are 3 forms of government that the church can happily work with: democracy, republicanism, and monarchy. An ideal government would reflect all 3 of those in some way, and that there are bad versions of each form of that, of those 3 government styles that the church is allowed to or not, like permissive. You know what I mean? I can't think of my words right now. So I'm very much a Thomist in that regard. So I'm just nervous about the absolutism. Ideally, it would work that way if you'd have a king and you'd have your aristocracy and then you'd have your middle class and stuff, if we're talking about a fully functioning monarchy in an industrial society. But we don't know if it would look that way. And I don't think that like an absolute monarchy, like I don't think that ideals of republicanism or the ability to elect in some way is inherently anti-Christian or is against the Christian ideal of a monarchy, just because the ancient biblical model of Israelite monarchy didn't function that way. I don't think we can immediately transfer over and say, nor just because Christendom didn't function that way doesn't mean we shouldn't do those things now, or that it immediately invalidates republicanism. I have to be careful with citing this man because I don't agree with him on everything that he says. There's a couple things he's very hyperbolic on, and it makes me nervous.
Who?
But Tim Gordon has his book, Catholic Republic, where he is reflecting. He's one of the more famous rad trads who are actually defenders of classical liberalism, which can sound like an oxymoron. Timothy Flanders, who runs a website called Meaning of Catholic, just did like a 2-hour podcast episode called Is Liberalism a Sin?, where he had defenders of liberalism and anti-liberalists, I don't know, meaning classical liberalism, and discussed the topic back and forth. I highly recommend everybody give that a listen if you can. Timothy Gordon has appeared on a couple podcasts discussing his Catholic Republic book, Patrick Coffin being the big one. I think Taylor Marshall interviewed him on it as well. Just to hear a different perspective, that the founding ideals of the American government are more Catholic than a lot of people think. I think that he makes an okay argument for it. It's not perfect. I have several political scholar friends who have argued against it, but it's there to exist. Now I'll take my modernist cap off for a little bit.
Okay.
I need to offer some level of pushback.
I would like to quantify a few things.
Go for it, please.
Kevin, I did not answer your question about the why an absolute monarchy. I guess I do need to define that.
I just want to make sure. I don't know if you're talking like,
no, that's a valid point.
The Sun King or something else that I haven't heard the term used for.
Okay. So in regards to absolute monarchy, when I say that, I don't mean that there are no checks and balances. There certainly are. And my background is medieval literature. That's what my MA is in. But so what I mean is that, for me, a monarch that does not have what we call the absolutist power is not really a monarch. So, for example, like if you look at England today, it's a sad sight. It's a really sad sight to see one of the great lines in England has virtually no power at all. They have a lot of social collateral, a lot of social credit, if you will, as far as influencing certain political things, but to me, it's like they're monarchs in title and lineage only. As far as ruling, they have no ruling really whatsoever. It's the parliament that has all the power. But I think there are certain checks and balances that are to be had even in a monarchy, especially in a Christian monarchy, and that is the relationship to the church. Okay. And like, for example, there have been times in England where a king has done something rather nasty, and then the archbishop would excommunicate the king from the church, right? And the kings would be like pounding on the door, being begged to let back in, because for them that was like hell, basically. So you have things like that which would check and balance a lot of different things. Also, the relationship to other nobles. So, for example, you'd have dukes, you'd have lords, you'd have barons, governors, all kinds of things like that, which would have considerable influence over places. It's not that the king, for example, couldn't depose of a noble that was underneath him. I mean, he could snap his fingers and say, cut off the guy's head. But the one thing he has to think about is the blowback he's going to get if he makes that kind of rash decision. So, for example, if he had a duke who was resisting something the king wanted to do, like the king wants to buy a plot of land from a duke, and the duke keeps saying, no, I'm not going to sell it to you. And the king says, all right, I'm just going to kill the guy. So he goes and kills him. It's made public. And then all of a sudden, all the duke's family is going to declare war against the king. And then nobody really wants a war, especially in that time period. So there are checks and balances that may not be necessarily constitutional checks and balances, but there are a lot of social checks and balance that are intrinsic into the stratification of a monarchy as far as the nobility goes. As far as the social stratification goes, yes, at the most basic form, you had the monarch, the nobles, and then the peasants, the poor. However, I wouldn't necessarily say that's a very oversimplified thing, because when you say peasants, you could mean the beggar and the prostitute, which is probably the lowest end of society. But you would also include the serfs who work the land for a landlord, which is where we get the term landlord, who actually more studies are showing most at a fairly decent living with fairly decent food.
No,
and
because I don't want to tote like the very modernist reading of like everyone was like starving to death perpetually. Like, no, it didn't work that way. Like, that's just not how, like, I made a joke to one friend. Because again, me with psychology, I was like, we don't have any records of like great mass suicides throughout the medieval era because like no one had any meaning and they were just like trapped in their circumstance. Like people would have done that. Like if we had such a grave level of despair back then, like no amount of religious force would stop you from doing that. You know, there's plenty of religious people that commit suicide, and they clearly know the terms, which is why like suicide's an illness and it's a complicated subject, but that's neither here nor there, which does get into the cultural or slash psychological benefits of monarchy, which is, as you mentioned, there is a stability in there being a father of the nation or a mother of the nation. You know, there is something in there being like, I know that there is this person who ideally is above the kind of more minor squabbles of the realm. Honestly, I mean, there's that great book, Democracy, the God That Failed, that actually says monarchy is more libertarian than a lot of people would admit. Pay your taxes and the king really doesn't give a damn what you're doing. Like, you know, just it's up to you and your local lord. Like, you know, the king really could care less about you as long as you like nod in his general direction.
As long as you're not threatening him or anything like that. You know, saying I'm going to kill the king or whatever, you know.
So there is a stability there because, I mean, what attachment or stability? Because human beings... Something that I do agree with Jordan Peterson on is that we human beings ideally should be walking on the line of order and chaos. We won't have enough order in our lives that we feel stable enough to enter into chaos. And it's kind of like constant birthing and changing, which is just a very Jungian idea. So when society is constantly in a political upheaval, I don't know, about every 4 years, it's really hard to find stability. But then again, I hate to even, this is such a complicated issue and I hate to be like the one to pull that card, but because of stuff like globalism and things, it's very hard to like, in my opinion, give a proper thing, because we're debating between ideals and practical realities on anything like this. Because, like, if you go back to, like, what, pre-1850 America, do you think anybody really cared what the president was doing? No, not at all. Like you can't say, but, like, now presidents have way more power over people than any king ever did in history. Like, we could just drone strike me right now if they wanted to, you know, like, and just call me a terrorist. Or just suspend habeas corpus again, Lincoln. But, like, you know, but, like, so it's hard to say, like, this is just, maybe this is me giving a bit more pushback, but like, it's hard to say that people lived like more unstable lives under a functioning American republic that in like the 1830s than they did under a good medieval king. But like, then you have to argue like, okay, well, which one's more Christian? I do think it's the monarchy, which is why it's more ideal. But that doesn't mean that republics are inherently anti-Christian and can have very traditionally Christian ideals in their founding. I hate to be the guy that doesn't really have an opinion and is just kind of pushing back in every general direction. What you're saying.
I think one thing that, you know, we need to realize is that there's a difference between, like, Caleb mentioned, and actually Matthew mentioned it as well, but Aristotle talks about 3 different types of government that are valid, so to speak. The best government is monarchy. The second best government is what he called aristocracy.
And the third best republic.
Yeah.
Right, which is where we get the concept of republic. And the third was timocracy, which is basically like the early Americas where only landowners could vote. Only the male head of house landowner could vote. That's a timocracy.
That was their Republic of America.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Now, he does point out that all of those have sort of an equal opposite evil twin. For the monarch. The monarch's evil twin is the tyrant. We're not here to say that tyranny is good. so the tyrant is bad, although as Caleb pointed out, it's better to be a philosopher under a tyranny than under a democracy.
In a democracy, everybody believes they're their own authority. There is no authority in a democracy.
And I definitely agree that we undervalue what our political system, how our political system has impacted our way of thinking, way of viewing ourselves. I've recently taken to kind of viewing psychology, as I call it, practical philosophy, or like how our worldviews and philosophies kind of influence our behavior and perspectives. That's more or less what you're like. This is ignoring like complicated trauma or like Alzheimer's and dementia and complicated problems of neuroscience. But like for the average everyday, it seems, and I think the reaction to people like Jordan Peterson and stuff show this, a lot of our modern neuroses are coming from more simple problems, or like actually more systemic problems than we initially thought, because we are viewing the world in maladaptive ways. And this gets into like Frankel. So I agree, in the democracy, there's so much pressure on you to be like, I am my own authority and I need to have a good judgment and an educated opinion on everything, when most people really don't want to. And I agree with you. Yeah. Like, how many people do you hear say, like, I don't care about politics, but then they'll just like go and vote kind of haphazardly? Like, I agree with you. Like, in some level, in some kind of a monarchy where either there is no voting whatsoever, or voting only has to do with like on the very local level, where it's much easier to care about because it's like, well, this is my hometown. So like, you don't have to be an academic to get the issues of your hometown and can vote on them like pretty responsibly. Like, you could just live in a monarchy because it's like, oh, I don't have to worry about voting. I don't have to worry about politics because other people are taking care of it for me. And that's okay. And again, like, I don't know if in an absolute monarchy, a thing like a constitution could exist. Like, is the Magna Carta a good thing? Like, because I hate to get so Lockean, but like, is there a social contract relationship between monarch and people that kind of need to be upheld? And, you know, the people are faithful and loyal to the government, because it kind of did exist. It's where serfdom comes from. We moved from slaves to serfdom, and that now, instead of you being worthless, the local lord had a responsibility to you just as much as you had a responsibility to your local lord. And it creates a more symbiotic relationship, more so than one, because like, I also don't want to be like I'm not a free market capitalist either. Like, I don't really know what I am. Like, I'm not saying like we are much better off now that we're slaves to our corporate overlords rather than our local lords. Again, I don't know what an industrial economy would look like. I don't know how I could give some of my work to my lord as a counselor. Like, I can understand food or like taking up arms and defending his land. Like, it's the more abstract the economy becomes, the more interesting or complicated the issue becomes. Maybe I'm just ranting a little bit, forgive me. I want to try and remain in the realms of the practical as much as discussing the ideal. I think that a very good, very convincing case can be made that, you know, monarchy is the ideal Christian form of government, but I don't think that invalidates many of other very respectable Christians who fall more on the libertarian scale or the Republican scale or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess that's the position I'm trying to advocate.
So I don't think that Caleb or I would say that somebody who is a libertarian.
And I'm not saying that's what you are. It's just like, I don't know if those opinions can immediately become like invalidated when there are plenty of very good, devout, rather traditional Christians who are way more in favor of republics over a king, or are way, and again, there's so many systematic reasons that they think that way, and blah 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 blah. But
I think the benefit of doing something like this, though, is that we have the ability to come in and sort of correct those ideas, so that people who are like what you're describing, where you have an honest Christian who's examining these things, they have an opportunity to see sort of the other side and comprehend why it is that a monarchy is a better system, even if we don't live in a monarchy. Now, I do want to move into, we've got a couple more topics that I want to cover because I think that they're quite important, and this will give Matthew, I think, a little bit more of a chance to play devil's advocate here on these topics as well. But Caleb, why don't you talk to us about, we mentioned earlier that England has sort of fallen from being the fairly ideal monarchy that they once were, and now they're a parliamentary system with a king at the top. Can you break down sort of the English Civil War and the history behind that for us a little bit and help us understand sort of the footnotes version of how England got to the point where they are today and why that's not ideal?
Sure. Now, this is going to be very oversimplified. But basically, the English Civil War started over several issues. One had to do with the glaring fact that Charles I wanted nothing to do with Puritanism at all. There was a growing, yeah, thank God, there was a growing Puritan population in England during the time, mainly Puritan Presbyterians, and but also a growing number of Puritan Congregationalists that were starting to sweep England by storm. Now, the roots of this were kind of laid down sort of by Thomas Cranmer, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, who tried to sort of sneak in Calvinistic thoughts into the Book of Common Prayer. And if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of see where it is. But anyway,
yeah, that's why there was riots in the streets with that first Book of Common Prayer.
Oh, yeah.
Because even the ignorant peasants could see what he was doing.
Yes, and that's the ironic thing about it is when Thomas Cranmer became Archbishop, most of England wanted to be Catholic, Catholic without a pope, which I think is pretty ideal. But
exactly,
we're all wrong.
Yeah. So anyway, long story short is so Charles started doing things to purposefully piss off the Puritans. So the first thing he did is he married a Catholic, and
like a boss.
Yes, he married a Roman Catholic. His archbishop at the time was my boy, Archbishop William Laud, who wrote his own prayer book, who was very anti-Puritan. So much so that when Puritans would come into his church and his churches and interrupt the services, because Laud brought back the altar and put it in the east, he brought back the crucifixes, the incense, the full vestments for the Anglican bishops and priests, and whenever the Puritans would purposefully go in and try to disrupt a service, he would have the guards bring him to him, and he'd have their ears cut off. Yeah, he'd say, "Oh, you didn't hear me the first time when I said don't interrupt church services? Okay." He's like, "Take off his ear." And then he'd send him back into the street, and they're like, "Oh, there's a church disruptor, walking down the street with his ear cut off." And but anyway, little things like this started to boil over, and eventually the Roundheads, as they called them, which were the English Puritans, Presbyterians mainly, led by none other than Oliver Cromwell, who was a member of Parliament, led a rebellion against Charles I. And to say the least, it did not end well for Charles I. He was captured. William Laud was beheaded earlier, but he was Charles I was in jail, I think, 2 years before he was finally sentenced to death. And the ironic thing was that the English Presbyterians were always chanting, "No king but Christ, no king but Christ." And then they said, "Hey, Cromwell, you want to rule?" Which is, it's like, really? But that's
put
sort
him
of
with servant of Satan there.
Yes, and Cromwell was just a jerk. I mean, he outlawed Christmas. He hanged nuns and priests in their parishes. He hanged monks. He burned monasteries. I mean, he smashed stained glass windows, and some of his soldiers would pee on crucifixes and altars. I mean, really nasty stuff. And eventually what ended up happening is Cromwell ruled so poorly that the English people ended up asking Charles II, who was Charles I's son, to come back and rule them. But that's the English Civil War in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's interesting.
The first is also the only formally canonized person in the Anglican Church, which is
that is true.
Yes, that is true. King Charles the Martyr. Yeah,
that's right. And it's interesting because when Charles II took the throne, I think it's Yorkshire, England, had actually supported Cromwell, and they had crafted this beautiful ring for Charles II and if you look closely at the ring, the inscription on it basically says, Yorkshire faithful to the king, always faithful.
Oh boy.
So, and it's really fascinating because if you go to Yorkshire today, it's one of the most monarchist, firmly established monarchist strongholds in all of England. So they've really rewritten their own history to say we've always been on the side of the king. We hated that Cromwell guy.
Yeah, and
I mean that was kind of what you were saying about how terrible Cromwell's leadership really was. But even
the Lord Protector is a pretty awesome title. I got to give it to him for that. That's
it's a king. It's the same thing.
Yeah,
it's a king, not a
Lord Protector is a great way of describing a king, isn't it?
Yes.
So with that kind of in mind, obviously England has never been the same since the English Civil War, because after that, although they put in Charles II rightly, they failed to go back to the monarchist system as it was. They went to the constitutional monarchy that they have today.
Yeah, and I think that Charles kind of messed that up for himself, in all honesty. I mean, he had the throne, and the first thing he did is dissolve Parliament. He didn't trust Parliament. Parliament had put his dad to the axe, rightly so, but he did it in such a way where he was just like shooting his middle finger to everybody, and he wanted to make sure that they understood why he was doing it. And not only that, but he converted to Roman Catholicism. He's like, you accused my dad and my sister of being Roman Catholics, which they were not. They were very explicitly not in their writings. They wrote extensively why they weren't Roman Catholic. But he's like, oh, you suspected my dad of Catholicism? Well,
I'll just be one.
I'll just be one and remove all doubt. And yeah, that sort of wasn't the right move.
Yeah, that's a great way to really ruin your chances.
Anti-papist population.
Yeah, goodbye monarchy once you do that. I mean, who's going to trust you after that? Yeah.
So with that in mind, and I think you're right, Charles II did not have, I mean, Charles I is a saint, is a true martyr, but Charles II was a little bit more of, we might say, a Tertullian. He kind of had that angry bent there that I think didn't help anything.
He wanted revenge.
But with that in mind, what we end up with in England is this hodgepodge of the modernity system that has swept all the nations, but they still try to preserve some of at least the traditions of monarchy. So Caleb, can you just kind of break down a little bit of why it is that sort of the mistakes England made and how a better monarchist system could function without some of their addendums?
Okay. I mean, I think the biggest problem, I think, was that started the ball rolling was King John. Have you noticed there's never been a king named John since King John?
Little John.
Yes. And I mean, I think the first mistake was being so afraid of John. And yeah, John was a terrible king, no doubt about it. But I think they were so afraid of John and that they ended up doing the whole Magna Carta thing. And when, in all honesty, John never had any children, as far as I know. Did he? I don't think he did.
I don't believe he did, no.
No. And I mean, but the point is, it seemed like a problem that would have balanced itself out once the new monarch got into power. So once you've already started that one thing where you're going to hold the king to some sort of secular law. Now, if the Magna Carta had been something like, let's hold the king to the church law, that has to balance it, I would be totally for that. But they held him to a secular law. I'm like, wait a minute. The whole point of the king is to be the head of the state. And
that's right.
And biblically, and this is going to sound very strange to people, but the king is supposed to be on par as like a bishop, a minister. He's a secular minister, right? That's why I always tell people the doctrine of the two swords in medieval theology, as well as in Luther's own theology, the doctrine of the two kingdoms,
is the Ecclesian diarchy.
Yeah, is the idea that the king has full jurisdiction over matters of state, secular matters, right? Whereas the church has full jurisdiction over matters of spirituality and religion. And just to give you an example how the early church thought of this, do you know what in the Eastern churches what the monarch was allowed to do?
He took communion like a priest. He also was allowed to preach.
He could commune himself. They considered him a validly ordained minister, and therefore he could go up to the altar where the consecrated bread was and commune himself and take the chalice and commune himself.
He was also allowed to preach during liturgy.
Yes, and now that was not. Now this was not a widespread practice. In fact, Ambrose of Milan, St. Augustine's own teacher, in fact, when an emperor came to visit his parish, he communed himself, and Ambrose nearly threw a fit. He was like, "Don't you?" Like he started hitting him with something, like, "Don't get away from that altar," you know. And then after things cooled down, he's like, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but we don't do that here."
Well, there's a lot of complications with that one, particularly because the East, this wasn't that widespread, but there was at least some theological speculation on whether or not there was some, obviously dispelled in the later church, but there was some question on how much of the sacrament is coronation. But then also you had a different relationship between the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire and his bishops and the various kings of Europe with the Pope of Rome, because you didn't have a unified empire upon which, it's where the term Caesaropapism comes from. So you have two different Christian political schools of thought developing in West and East, because the Pope has to deal with what do you do when you have a bunch of different Christian nations that aren't unified under
and they're killing each other and they're communing at your same table.
Yeah, and it's like, but we're all one big church. What do we do? At least the emperor could just do what he wanted. I mean, like, and the result, we see that, I'm not tinfoil hatting, but like, you can see the problem of this in Ukraine now, because all of this stuff was still thought of as imperial territory, imperial mission. Even whenever they Christianized Russia and stuff, Moscow was still under the Greek patriarch and like the concept of autocephaly is very weird, and you have to get into it. It never developed in the West because you always like it's very weird. You had primates of national churches, but the way national churches functions in the West, I don't think ever really functioned the way that we've seen national churches function in the East. And maybe that's the Latin in me, but like it's interesting. And the Gelasian diarchy represented not only the church's ability to buck kings and princes and dukes, but also the Pope of Rome's ability to slap anybody on a wrist and make sure that things were taken care of. There's a reason the tiara was worn, but that's neither here nor there. But when it comes to the Magna Carta signing, which is something I do want to go back to, like, bishops were there. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar in England was there at the signing. Like, I don't know if you can necessarily, because like, isn't any because like, when you get into check and balances and secular laws that are outside of the king checking them, I get where you're going with that, of like, if the king is the law, how can there be a law to check the king? I mean, but like, it's funny because I hear you talking so much about these kings, and these are the same things people say about the Pope. But so I have one question: why is it okay for a king but not a Pope? But that, again, that's a question for another time. But
I can answer that easily.
But like, it's like, I'm just curious because it's like, I don't think you could even say that like the Magna Carta, because like secularism wasn't even a thing. Like, that wasn't even a thought then. Like, if not, isn't the Magna Carta just a documentation of the understood rights and privileges of a people and their king. Like, you know, I don't know if you could say
Well,
like,
I do want to point out the Magna Carta often gets misrepresented. It's not really so much about the rights of the people. What the Magna Carta was actually doing was it was putting checks on King John, but those checks weren't so much about the people, so to speak. They were about the nobles, and it was really mostly about taxation. The nobles felt that King John had put in taxations that were unjust. In fact, the thing a lot of modern people don't know is that the story of Robin Hood, if Robin Hood was ever a real person, which he wasn't, but
don't
but
burst
what
my
that
bubble.
novel,
Next you're gonna tell me King Arthur wasn't real. Come on. No
but
time for this.
the point of that novel is that Robin Hood wouldn't really be stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Robin Hood would be taking back ill-gotten taxes from King John and giving them back to the nobles, not the people, because it was the nobles who were actually fighting against King John. The other point about the Magna Carta is that it was extremely temporary, not by intention. It was intended to be.
Well, no king followed
essentially
afterwards.
permanent.
Like the Magna Carta blipped into like basically
Right. The
irrelevant.
Magna Carta blipped into nothing. But the reason for that is because King John made good with the Pope and asked the Pope to invalidate the Magna Carta. And he sat on Peter's chair and said, hey, that Magna Carta thing is dumb.
Stupid.
And so then everybody had to give it up.
One correction I need to make is, yes, John did actually have a son. It was Henry III. I didn't know that. Okay.
Oh, yeah,
For our
that's right.
viewers, yeah, it was Henry III. So
That's right.
Yeah.
I had forgotten that too.
And for our viewers, since we're going to have people ask us in Scripture, like, how do we know a king is ordained by God? All I got to do is point to Romans chapter 13, verse 4, where it talks about governing authorities, where it says that for he, the magistrate, is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And I think that that passage also really documents what the function of the civil magistrate is. The church is a ministry of mercy and grace, and whereas the state is a ministry of justice. You know,
that's right.
The state's not meant to be merciful. You know, in other words, the state you get what you deserve, whereas the church you get what you don't deserve.
Exactly. And that's an important distinction as well, especially since oftentimes one of the things that comes up here is kind of the separation of church and state, as we say it. I don't like that terminology because it's very constitutionally and American-y. I prefer the two realms. The church has a realm that it governs. The state has a realm that it governs. And it's not that the twain shall never meet. It's just that there are some things that the state is simply not equipped to do.
Like denounce heresy, for example, or deal with heresy, for example.
The state is not really there to denounce heresy, whereas the church is there to denounce heresy. The state, frankly, the state isn't really there to give people medical care. The church should be there to give people medical care. That said, before I get hate mail on that, I'm not for the current system either. I think that insurance companies are a bunch of crooks. That said, I don't think that the ideal fix for it is to have another group of crooks take it over. So that's the problem there. And so I would say that in an ideal system, the church would take over medical things, and then we wouldn't have to have a conversation about making abortion illegal because the people doing medical care wouldn't perform abortions.
I think the abuse of those two is the fact that, like, you know, the way I would see it ideal is that the church would be the right hand and the state would be the left hand. It's not that they can't join and work together on certain things, because we do that all the time. It's that certain things this entity can do and certain things this entity can do and certain things they can and cannot do. So, for example, I think the church should be able to say, we are not giving communion to people who are in open adultery. We are not going to condone same-sex marriage, right? Mm-hmm. And what I think the government should say is that we're a secular institution and we can't perform marriages, period. It's a sacrament before God. There you go. And that's one of the weird ways where I actually bridge a lot of gaps between me and those who are for same-sex marriage. For example, I'm not for it at all. I'll make it very clear. But like, I think it's very, like, my one thing I'll say to him is, I'm like, you ever wondered why we have to go to Uncle Sam and get them to approve of a marriage? I'm like, I don't think they should have that power.
That's the most libertarian thing you've said so far.
This is where I kind of
no, exactly. It would be like going to a mechanic for heart surgery. Like, it doesn't make sense that the government has a finger in it. You know, like it's irrelevant. And so, like, I don't disagree on anything like that. Though I don't know, like, I think within the founding context, though it is a bit weird because like 7 of the 13 colonies had established religions, established state religions. But like separation of church and state, at least I'm going to defend the founders a little bit. So I'll get a confession later. I'll get a
We're
confession
getting
later.
to it, Kevin. Get ready. We're getting to the really controversial point.
Sorry. Checking an email from my school because COVID. But anyways, the founders, at least as I understand them, and my political scholar friends have told me, separation of church and state simply meant the federal government was not going to push a state religion on someone, which is why the colonies were permitted to retain their established religions after it's not like the Constitution was ratified in 1787 and immediately they all abandoned their state religions. It was just the federal government was not going to hold anyone to a particular state religion or enforce it on them, since they were all traumatized over post-England, post-Civil War, and everything that happened there. It's really Thomas Jefferson who pushed the modern interpretation of church and state, him solely, not like all of the founders in general.
And in general, I don't think that when that law was passed that they had in mind things like Islam or Hinduism or paganism or anything. I think mainly the two religions they were concerned about were Protestantism and Catholicism.
Yeah.
I have people who try to
putting it in its
Islam
historical context. Right, exactly. If you put it in its historical context, the Establishment Clause is actually saying that anybody can be any kind of Christian that they want to be in the United States, and nobody can force you to be anything other than, say, Presbyterian or Lutheran or Roman Catholic. You can be any of those things. It does not mean that you are necessarily seen as free to pursue just whatever you wanted to and worship a rock if you wanted to. That was not actually in the original intention.
Well, I mean, you see that with de Tocqueville and Democracy in America. Like, he assumed that it was going to be a majority Christian population, and that's how America. When going back to the whole topic, understanding of 3 different forms of government, like republicanism, in just the terms of living in a republic, res publica, like pluralism can't work. Like, just in that form of because like you all have to have a kind of you have to have a mutually vested interest in the city, like in the polis. And if there's like 50 million different opinions of the polis, the republic can't function anymore. That's not like decrying. It's not like decrying like people being different or anything like that. I'm obviously not doing that. I'm just saying, like, with the way the republic functions, there has to be certain mutually agreed upon vested interests for the city. Like, also, a republic is not supposed to be the size of a continent like ours is now. Like, if we're just going to talk about the American experiment for a couple seconds, like, we are not practicing a republic the way that it should be practiced. Like, it's because you can't like a person in California cannot have the same vested interest for the country of America as like I do in the middle of the Rust Belt. Like, we just have very different perspectives on what we think America is or our experience of America. Now, if we just had the Republic of Pittsburgh, even like that would work more enough, because at least all of us rural people around Pittsburgh consider Pittsburgh our city. And so we have more of a vested interest. But even then, the people in Pittsburgh have a very different understanding of themselves than I do out in rural Rust Belt. But but I'm not saying like every single town must be its own individual commune that like is I'm not that bad.
Right.
So like, again, it's hard to say, but like, again, I don't know if a monarchy should be the size of a continent. Like, I don't know if that's that good, because I don't know.
Well, I think Russia was the ideal system. So, my patron.
I know exactly. I know the Tsardom of Russia is exactly the way it should be. But like, monarchies formed around mutual people groups, more or less. It's like it's imperiums that incorporated tons of different people and stuff like that. So I don't know. I don't know what to do with that or necessarily where I'm going with that.
I think that, well, yes, I mean, you do have to have people who have the same idea, the same idea centered around the polis. But I think there's another thing that monarchy would promote better than republicanism would promote, and that's the idea of a cultus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the central binding ideal that everybody holds to. And one of the problems I've seen that's happened in the American experiment is we've become completely postmodern. There is no cultus that everybody holds to. For example, in the Roman Empire, everybody had the imperial religion that was the center of what they did. For example, even a person being installed as a tribune to the Senate was considered an act of religion. You had the priests who had to install him. You had if you conquered a neighboring city, you had to dedicate that city to Jupiter, who was the god of war. And then so you had this this underlying cultus that had weaseled its way into everything. I mean, you can see this in Muslim nations as well as in, of course, Europe as well. And I think what's happened in the European experiment is that we've now said, oh, believe whatever you want, just vote. And I'm like, oh.
No, I completely agree. Like, we've destroyed the cultus. I don't know if, like, I guess my not even my pushback, but I would just say, like, are republics inherently secular? And I would say no.
Oh.
What do you do with the Catholic republics of Europe in the medieval era, of like Venice and like merchant republics with an aristocracy? Like, I think that you can have a cultus and not have a king. I don't think that the king has to be the figurehead of the cultus.
I think that there's a possibility there, although I would point out that Venice was an extremely corrupt system as well.
We can, which again, I'm not saying one bad king and like, obviously original sin is going to muck up any system that we do, but like, if there is an encouraged, because I would even say, the Northwest Ordinance actually says that religion is necessary for a Republican government. I don't think that a republic, as we see right now, can function without a cultist. I don't think
that's true.
A state could function without a cultist. Like, I think it's just a necessary, and we're seeing right now the disintegration of society, of the civil realm, by not having an agreed upon cultist, because everyone is their cultist in their bedroom. That's not me making like a joke about what is it? That it's not me making a joke about like all being sex crazed, which we are a bit Freudian nowadays, but like, everyone has their own individual cultist, and that's what has shattered society.
Right.
So maybe just to kind of one more point, and then we'll wrap things up. We've talked a little bit about that, the disintegration of the American experiment. I want to go back a little bit and talk about the American experiment, how it began.
Mm-hmm.
So, Caleb, will you discuss for us a little bit of the American Revolution and how we came into a system, for our last point of this episode, how we came into the system we have, and why that's not ideal to have our Constitution that says everybody's created equal except Black people that are 3/5 of a person go.
Yeah. I mean, let's just put it this way: America was founded on rebellion. Let's just be upfront and honest about it. From a exclusively Christian perspective, and let me just be upfront about this. I want to be as patriotic as reasonably and theologically as permitted to whatever country I am loyal to.
Amen.
And I've looked into the American Revolution. I can't say I don't admire people like George Washington, and I don't admire a lot of people who fought for the American side. But everything I've looked through for how the rebellion started to how the colonists handled everything, I see no reason why a Christian should have participated in the colonial rebellion. Not one bit. I really don't. As per Romans chapter 13, I don't think that a Christian is would have been permitted to take up arms against their rightful monarch, even if the monarch was behaving bad. I'm not saying he wasn't. King George was clinically insane, no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. I don't actually think he did. The thing is, I will say this: he was clinically insane. I don't actually think he did anything wrong or egregious towards the colonists. Just to be full disclosure, I think every single thing that he did, I frankly side with George III and not any of the colonial arguments. I don't see anything he did as being in violation of any biblical precedent, frankly.
Right, and I have a lot of Presbyterian friends which a lot of the rebels were Presbyterians, who say that the king has overstepped his bounds, and that makes him no longer a king. And I'm like, show me in scripture where that is. I mean, because if we really want to get down to it, Nero is who Paul lived under. And if we want to talk about living under a bad monarch, I think Paul and the apostles have a lot to complain about. And I'm like, what are the colonists complaining about? Some taxes? I mean, where people are in ancient Rome are being crucified for their faith. And yet we don't see a rebellion against the emperor, or we don't see any Christians taking up arms against the emperor. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I do not believe in that you cannot defend yourself. I don't believe that you cannot take up arms. And in the American Revolution, I would have said, yes, the Christians should take up arms for the king.
Against the rebels.
Yes.
Exactly. I would have been donning my red coat.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I wear red because, I mean, that just makes you a target out there on the battlefield. I probably would have joined up with the Queen Mary's Rangers, who wore green. They were basically the precursor to the Army Rangers as we know it. But I mean, in that regard, I don't see. I mean, now I had maybe a feeling, okay, maybe we could apply a doctrine of lesser magistrates here, where you appeal to the local government who's under the king, because we're living in a constitutional monarchy by this time, or a parliamentary monarchy by this time, and it's like maybe if you appealed to that guy and the guy reasoned with the king and the king said, screw you, go away. And then the king sends troops to your state or whatever, your colony, and then the governor says, we need to defend this colony. I, as your governor, and I'm asking you to do that. I could see where you could make a valid case for defending yourself against the king in that regard, or at least his soldiers. But I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing the king, basically dissolving the governor's and the colony's leadership, and where they don't have any actual power anymore, but then them saying, well, we're still going to honor their government and make our own. And the thing is, I don't believe in consequentialism. I don't believe that because America had a good outcome at the end of the day, where it did. I mean, America has become a pretty good nation, at least in the last, well, not in the last 50 years, but let's just say in the first 100 years, America was a fairly good nation. It did a lot of good around the world, but I don't think that justifies how it came into existence. So in the way I would look at it, I would say that God took something that started very badly and did something really good with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think another point that has to be made here is that with Americanism, the tendency is to talk about liberty, 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 liberty. And I want to read a quote that was sent in to us by a friend of mine named Asriel, who is
I know who that
actually
is.
studying to become a lawyer. Yes. And so he sent this in to us. This is something that was, well, I'll just read it. It's from Morris R. Cohen from the book Reason and Law. And I apologize, there are some misprints in here. So if I'm reading it and I say something that sounds weird, it's not my
No
fault.
worries. No worries.
Okay. So the word liberty has become a symbol around which have clung some of the most generous human emotions. We have been brought up to thrill with admiration at the men who say, "Give me liberty or give me death." But the philosopher asks whether all those who are devoted to liberty mean the same thing. Does liberty or freedom, for instance, involve free trade? Does it involve freedom to preach race hatred or to overthrow all that we regard as sacred? Many who believe in liberty characterize the freedom which they are not willing to grant as license, and they do it so often that one may be inclined to think that what we really need is less liberty and more license. Moreover, there is a confusion between the absence of legal restraint and the presence of true freedom as positive power to do what we want. The legal freedom to earn millions of dollars, for example, isn't worth a cent to one who has no real opportunity to do so. It is fashionable to assert that men want liberty on above all other things, but a strong case may be made out for the direct contrary. Absolute freedom is just precisely what people do not want. Again, that's Morris R. Cohen in Reason and Law. So the reason why I read that is because I made sort of a derogatory reference to our Constitution earlier. But what the Constitution is trying to do is create an entire system centered around the idea that liberty is the highest ideal and that in some sense the government's purpose is to protect our liberty. So my question is liberty the highest ideal? Is freedom really a higher ideal? And I would argue that even within our own political system, we have to answer no, it isn't. Because if liberty was really the highest ideal, then why is it that we object so strongly to somebody setting up a Facebook page called I Hate Black People? And we should object to that. I think setting up that Facebook page is wicked and sinful. And I even think that there could be a situation in which it would be righteous for government intervention to take place and say, yeah, you can't be posting that it's cool to lynch people. That's not righteous. And we're going to hold you accountable for this. But the problem is that if liberty is the highest ideal and freedom of speech is the greatest thing ever, then why is this guy's speech less free than my speech? And it becomes a dangerous thing, I think, and that's why I've had long conversations with people who are libertarian who think that there should be no government intervention at all for people saying terrible, horrible things about wanting to lynch black people or wanting to murder people, wanting to do all sorts of terrible things. And I just can't see how it's righteous to say freedom of speech, my liberty, is worth people being frankly abused in this way. And so, Caleb, would you like to offer your impressions on that concept?
Yeah, I think that liberty and rugged individualism is sort of the norm for American society, and it's a tragedy that it is. Because one, biblically, this idea of rugged individualism simply doesn't exist. The church has always seen herself as a collective whole. That's including things like salvation as well. And I think that when we make liberty the I guess the hill we're going to die on, or the idol that we worship, so to speak, that we sort of miss the entire point of government, which is to sustain order. I mean, government's highest goal should be to administer justice. And in short, that means to avenge wrongs and to reward right. You know, I think that this, America has done a terrible job of doing both. For example, they'll lock away somebody who kills a man who's assaulting their children.
That's right.
And that's not rewarding. That man should be given a medal.
That's right.
Not locked in a jail cell. And then we give a slap on the wrist to people who do wrong things. Like when we see child molesters only get 3 years in jail, and then the guy who smokes pot gets 20 years in jail. I mean,
right.
It's like,
it doesn't
really
make any sense.
I think that's where this path of rugged individualism, and as well as the pursuit of liberty and pursuit of happiness, has taken us. Because when you pursue happiness is just a fleeting thing. One thing that makes you happy today is not necessarily going to make you happy tomorrow. Whereas joy is something totally different. It's transcendent, way above happiness. You can be joyful even in your suffering.
That's right.
I think justice does provide for freedom in certain things. Like, for example, I think it's unjust to tell a parent how to raise their children, right? I think it's unjust for the government to come in and say, no, you can't teach your children these values, etc. So if we had true justice and a government that pursued justice, there wouldn't be things like where you could go into a public square like they've done in South America, and these pro-abortion people can dress like the Virgin Mary and then act like they're performing an abortion on Mary to kill Jesus. I think that if there were true justice, things like that would not happen.
That's right.
I think we've made an idol of both liberty and individualism, and it's a kind of a deadly cocktail.
And I obviously agree with all that. Like, all that's bad. Racism is bad. Performing an abortion of the Virgin Mary is blasphemy. Like, racism is one of the sins that cry to heaven for vengeance, in fact. But I agree with true justice, but like, if liberty, classically understood in the Aristotelian sense, or freedom, as he says, is the ability to act according to the natural law, or like act towards virtue. Like, as I've often heard described, like, I am free to just walk up and start hitting keys on a piano, but I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to make like bad sound. But if I take the time to rehearse the piano after years and years of discipline, now I'm free to sight read whatever I want, because I've like worked hard to live. Like true freedom is the ability to live the good as a habit. That's what Thomas and Aristotle always said.
I agree.
And I think that the founders were closer to, just again to defend them. Forgive me, I'll take my tripart hat off later. But I should have brought mine down and put it on every time I
the news.
Something. I think they were closer to the classical understanding. I think they were closer to the classical understanding of liberty, and not like, you can go out and like rape a chicken if you want to. Like, I don't think that's what like any of them were thinking. Not to be overly hyperbolic, but like, I don't think that the founders were just like, we are going to make this libertarian utopia where people can do whatever we want because we wanted the freedom to act according to natural law. Because I'm not saying that their interpretation of this is right, but they in some way felt that their natural law rights were being infringed upon. Sure. And they wanted to found a government in which natural law rights were enshrined, and you were at liberty to exercise your natural rights. So I don't know if like our postmodern understanding of freedom can immediately be teleported back into the founding documents, because postmodernism, while the Enlightenment was around, postmodernism wasn't around yet. And not that I don't think its seeds weren't there. I'm not saying that or anything.
Sure.
But like, I don't know if you can throw it back and to be like, because the pursuit of happiness is what we said in the Constitution, it is now, because like, we don't see the American populace immediately react that way. And I think a lot of the things that pushed us down that way were different injections of the culture in the 1900s for different reasons, not because. And I also just have to push back. I hate to keep doing this, but like, I don't think that just because you're a republic doesn't mean that true justice can't be maintained or justice can't be enforced. Like, just because there isn't a king sitting on a throne doesn't mean that you can't have a government that enshrines justice.
Well, I will push back on that a little bit and say, I think you're right. I think that you can have a republic that acts in a just way. That said, I don't think that a republic or democratic form of government is ideal to that. Richard M. Weaver discusses the concept that when you have a system, like he uses the example of the American South, and he says it's true that the quote-unquote gentlemen in the American South didn't always behave gentlemanly. However, having the ideal of the gentleman still creates a better society because you have an ideal that's looked to. So in a monarchist society, sometimes, we were talking about the king being ordained earlier, and Caleb discussed Romans 13. You could also, for Christian kings, you could talk about 1 Samuel, where first Saul and then David receives the actual physical anointing. In a system like that, did David always live up to the ideal of kingship? Well, no. As we said before, you can go through everything Deuteronomy 17 actually says for a king to be and do, and you won't really find that in David's life. But nevertheless, having that ideal still protects and preserves a better form of society than simply not having the ideal does. And the other thing I would point to is, you're right that the founder's definition of pursuit of happiness would be very different than the definition in force today. But I would argue that the problem is that the seeds are being laid, and I can't stress enough that the United States was an experiment. It was the first time where a government was established that did not have the ideals of order and discipline in place, but instead had these ideals of liberty and freedom in place. And I would argue that a lot of the things that come later only can exist because they're able to sort of ferment in this culture that was established at not just our revolution, but also, the French Revolution. I'm not certain that I'm not certain that any of these things happen if you don't already have, to a certain extent, the United States saying, look, we did it and it worked. That just throws the ball out for everybody to start becoming an authority unto themselves all over the world. And that is what we see today, unfortunately.
And the one pushback I would offer, golly, I'm sorry. The one pushback I think I would offer to that is that I think in regards to natural law, which I would believe in, I think if one person is really acting on natural law, that they would logically conclude monarchy.
Yes.
In the sense, like, for example, you see in philosophy the great chain of being, where you have God on top, then the celestial beings, the angels, and then you have humans, then animals, etc. I think that just knowing that there's a hierarchy out there, in the created order, like you have, we use this in animal classification systems. For example, there's some animals we call higher animals, like the apes and the dolphins and the dogs and things like that. And I think when you just realize that sort of thing exists in nature without you having to really do anything, such as the lion being the king of the beasts. The reason why they called him that is because he has no natural predators and he's top of the food chain. What he does affects everything else in the area he rules. And then that there are servant animals like the ox and the donkey and the horse and things like that. I mean, at least that's what I would glean from it. But
that's right. I think that the very concept of natural law does lend itself to a monarchist framework for those exact reasons.
Mhm.
With that, we are at about the time to head out. So the last thing that I will say is, for everybody who's stuck with us, thank you very much for watching. And I'm going to close out a little bit differently. Everybody recommend one book on monarchy to help our viewers study this out a little bit more deeply. Mine is going to be Andrei Davidov's, what is it? Darn. Had it in my mind because I was going to do this. It is, got it right here. Ideology of Monarchy by Andrei Davidov, a Russian philosopher. So that's mine. Matthew, what's a book that you would recommend on this topic?
I'm trying to look behind myself to try and dig up. Let me see here. Aha, there it is.
I'm scrambling too, so go right ahead. Take your time.
All right. Okay, found it. It's called Liberty or Equality, The Challenge of Our Times. This came recommended to me by a very near and dear friend of mine who studies politics far deeper than I ever could. But this is a good treatment on monarchy.
Awesome.
There's a book I'm trying to locate.
Also, legally, I can't say that I endorse everything said in this book. So, just have to cover my bases there. Don't need to get myself flamed. Don't need to get myself flamed anytime soon.
I am desperately trying to find this book, guys. But there is a book that was, I don't know if it was a book or a treatise, but I think it was a book. It was written by King James, the King James of England.
Oh, wow.
And it was on the whole idea of monarchy in a Christian context, and he actually, even made the quote in this book that kings are often called gods in the Old Testament because in a way they reflect the heavenly court where God rules. So, and he's right.
You are an absolutist.
In Hebrew, yeah, sometimes kings are called gods, Elohims, that rule underneath God. I can't think of the name of the book right now, but if I find it, I will send it to whoever wants to read it. But it's by King James II, I think. So interesting.
Excellent. And I will actually make one more point, and that is that, well, he's not a monarchist. The book by Richard M. Weaver, Ideas Have Consequences. I think if you're totally anti-monarchy right now and you think, well, that's just an antiquated system, read Ideas Have Consequences, and I think you'll at least have a greater appreciation for why we don't just say, well, nobody does that anymore, therefore it's dumb. So that's about all for today. Thank you so much, Caleb, for joining us. Thank you, Matthew, for co-hosting. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody who watched. Please share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless you.
God bless you guys. See y'all later.